December 27, 1944. A frozen field 3 kilometers northwest of Bastogne, Belgium. Captain Thomas Harrison of the IX Troop Carrier Command's 50th Wing Operations Staff crouched in ankle-deep snow, examining equipment scattered across what had been Drop Zone Able for the past 4 days. This makes no sense. 4 days of precision drops through weather that should have made it impossible, and they did it with this? Harrison held up a handheld Aldis lamp, the kind used for visual aircraft signaling. Standard military issue, probably cost $12. The glass lens was cracked. The battery compartment showed corrosion from days of exposure to Belgian winter. Around him lay the detritus of the most successful emergency resupply operation in the European theater. Collapsed parachute silk frozen into the mud. Empty ammunition crates, medical supply containers with their red cross markings still visible through the frost. The numbers made it extraordinary. Between December 23 and December 26, 1944, 241 C-47 transport aircraft had flown into this perimeter through an 800-foot cloud ceiling, heavy German anti-aircraft fire from 88mm positions ringing the town, and visibility conditions that grounded most other air operations in the theater. They delivered 144 tons of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Recovery rate, 95%. Aircraft losses, 12 planes, acceptable under the circumstances. What made it impossible was how they'd done it. The Eureka-Rebecca radar beacon system, the standard Pathfinder guidance technology, hadn't worked properly in the mountainous Ardennes terrain. Radio direction finding equipment kept getting jammed or producing false returns off the ridge lines. Yet somehow, cargo pilots flying at 400 feet through concentrated flak had found this exact field day after day and put their loads precisely where the 101st Airborne Division could recover them. Harrison stood and surveyed the field. At 500-yard intervals, he could see where pathfinders had positioned themselves. 3 locations, 3 lamps, creating what amounted to a visual corridor through cloud cover that meteorological reports described as near zero visibility at ground level. Intelligence officers back at Wing Headquarters were convinced the Germans had simply gotten their assessment wrong. Maybe the clouds had been thinner than reported. Maybe the pathfinders had managed to get the Eureka beacons working intermittently. Maybe the cargo pilots had just gotten lucky 241 times in a row. Harrison didn't believe in that much luck. Someone, something, had figured out something. Something that left no electronic signature the Germans could detect. Something that worked when military science said it shouldn't. The war had seen its share of improvised solutions. Soldiers adapted, innovated, survived. But this was different. This was 241 aircraft, thousands of pounds of ordnance, tens of thousands of lives depending on ammunition and medical supplies reaching them through conditions that should have made precision drops impossible. Harrison picked up a second lamp from the snow, then a third. Standard Aldis lamps, all of them. Handheld signaling devices. Nothing sophisticated. Nothing that would explain how C-47 pilots had followed them through clouds and flak to hit a target the size of a football field with 95% accuracy. Someone knew something, Harrison thought. Someone had done this before. Not in combat, somewhere else. Somewhere you needed to signal through obstacles in zero visibility. He looked at the lamps again. Simple technology. Proven technology. Used for decades in situations where line-of-sight communication was impossible. The question wasn't what technology they'd used. The question was, where had someone learned to use it this way? The journey to Bastogne had begun 4 months earlier, though none of the men involved knew it at the time. September 17, 1944, marked the largest airborne operation in military history. Operation Market Garden. the attempt to seize bridges across the Rhine and end the war by Christmas. Staff Sergeant Kenneth Cordry, a 28-year-old pathfinder with the 101st Airborne Division's Pathfinder Detachment, jumped into occupied Holland with the first wave. Cordry's personnel file told an unremarkable story. Born 1916 in Matewan, West Virginia. Enlisted June 1942. Airborne training at Fort Benning. Assigned to the 101st in early 1943. Qualified as a pathfinder in February 1944. Jumped into Normandy on D-Day as part of the advance element that marked Drop Zone C for the 501 Parachute Infantry Regiment. What the personnel file didn't mention, Cordry had spent 8 years before the war working 2,000 feet underground in the Pittsburgh Coal Company's Mine No. 47 outside Matewan. He'd started at 16, following his father and 2 older brothers into the tunnels. By 1940, he was a shift supervisor responsible for managing teams in the deepest shafts, where coal seams 2 feet thick required men to work lying on their sides in near total darkness. Coal miners in the 1930s developed sophisticated nonverbal communication systems. Electric lighting was limited. Battery-powered cap lamps provided individual illumination, but coordinating work across hundreds of yards of tunnel required something else. Mine foremen used specialized signaling patterns with handheld lights. Different sequences meant different things. 3 short flashes, move forward. 2 long flashes, stop. Alternating short and long, emergency. Evacuate immediately. The technique dated to British coal mining in the 1880s, refined over decades into a standardized system that every underground worker learned. The principles were simple. In environments with obstacles blocking line of sight, reflected light from tunnel walls and coal dust particles created a diffused glow visible at greater distances than direct illumination. Specific flash patterns cut through the diffusion, carrying information without words. Cordry had spent 8 years using these signals. He knew them instinctively. When he enlisted in 1942, he mentioned his mining experience during initial processing. The Army was always looking for men with technical skills, but nobody thought it relevant to paratrooper training. He learned to jump, learned to navigate by compass and stars, learned to operate the Eureka radar beacon that would guide transport aircraft to designated drop zones. Operation Market Garden had been his 3rd combat jump. The Pathfinders went in first, as always. September 17th, 09:35 hours. Cordry's team landed west of San, responsible for marking Drop Zone B. They'd set up the Eureka beacon, marked the drop zone with colored panels, and guided in the main body of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment without incident. But Market Garden failed. The British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem was destroyed. The 82nd and 101st spent 72 days fighting in Holland. Not the quick breakthrough operation planned, but a grinding, attritional battle in waterlogged fields and frozen positions. Cordry's Pathfinder detachment operated throughout, marking supply drop zones, guiding resupply flights, adapting to Dutch weather that ranged from fog to freezing rain to early snow. It was during this period that Cordry first noticed the problem with the Eureka-Rebecca system in certain terrain. The radar beacons worked perfectly in flat, open areas, but in rolling country with ridgelines and thick vegetation, the signal bounced unpredictably. Sometimes cargo pilots picked up the beacon miles away from the actual drop zone. Sometimes they didn't pick it up until they were directly overhead. Pathfinder doctrine didn't have a good answer for this. The assumption was that radar technology would work. When it didn't, you improvised, with visual signals, colored smoke, ground panels, signal flares. But those only worked if pilots could see the ground. In clouds or fog, visual signals were useless. Or so everyone assumed.
Cordry remembered waiting in a foggy Dutch field on November 3, 1944, trying to guide in a resupply drop for the 506 PIR. The Eureka beacon was malfunctioning, probably damaged in the previous day's German artillery barrage. Fog ceiling at 200 feet. He could hear the C-47s overhead, but couldn't see them. He'd pulled out his handheld signal lamp, standard Pathfinder equipment for direct aircraft communication, and started flashing upward. Not the standard aircraft recognition signals, the old mining pattern. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short.
The coal seam flash, miners called it, because it was how shift supervisors guided crews through seams where roof height dropped below 3 feet and you had to crawl. The pattern worked by creating a recognizable rhythm that cut through visual obstacles. In coal mines, the light reflected off dust particles and rock surfaces. In fog, theoretically, it should do the same thing. Water droplets would scatter the light, but the distinctive pattern might be visible to pilots looking for it. The C-47s had found him. Not all of them, maybe half the flight. But those that did put their bundles precisely on target. Cordry mentioned it in his after-action report, but nobody paid attention. Mission successful, problem solved, move on to the next operation. 6 weeks later, Cordry's Pathfinder detachment was back in France, resting at Mourmelon. The 101st had suffered heavy casualties in Holland. The Pathfinders had been pulled back for rest and refitting. Nobody expected them to jump again before spring. Then came December 16, 1944, and the German offensive in the Ardennes. The initial German assault shattered the American front across a 60-mile sector. Within 24 hours, Wehrmacht forces had penetrated 15 miles into the Allied lines. By December 18, they'd created a bulge 30 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Panic spread through 1st Army headquarters. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower identified the key terrain immediately: Bastogne, Belgium, a nondescript town of 3,500 people, but 7 paved roads converged there. Control Bastogne, and you controlled movement through the Ardennes. Lose Bastogne, and German armor would have clear routes west to the Meuse River and beyond. December 18, 1600 hours, the 101st Airborne Division received orders to move north immediately. Acting Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had 4 hours to get 11,000 men on the road. The division was under strength, short on ammunition, and equipped for garrison duty, not winter combat. They loaded into trucks and departed anyway. December 19, 0600 hours. Lead elements of the 101st entered Bastogne as German forces approached from 3 directions. Within 12 hours, the town was surrounded. McAuliffe's troops established a circular defensive perimeter approximately 16 miles in circumference. Behind those lines, 18,000 American soldiers from the 101st, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, remnants of other units, and approximately 2,000 Belgian civilians who'd been unable to evacuate. The supply situation was critical from the start. The 101st had departed Mourmelon with minimal ammunition, approximately 10 rounds per rifle, basic loads for machine guns and mortars, limited artillery shells. Medical supplies were adequate for normal operations, but nowhere near sufficient for sustained combat. Food rations were calculated for 72 hours. December 20 through 22. German forces probed the Bastogne perimeter constantly, attempting to identify weak points. American artillery fired in support of defensive positions, burning through ammunition reserves. Casualties mounted. By December 22, the 101's medical detachment was treating over 400 wounded, with supplies designed for perhaps 50. Artillery batteries were rationing shells to 10 per gun per day. Food had been cut to 1/3 rations.
Lieutenant Colonel Carl Coles, the 101st Supply Officer, calculated they'd run out of everything by December 24. Without resupply, the garrison would be combat ineffective by Christmas Day. After that, surrender or annihilation were the only options. The weather made aerial resupply seemed impossible. The Ardennes was locked under a massive weather system that had moved in December 17. Clouds at 800 feet, sometimes lower, fog banks, freezing rain, snow squalls. Meteorological conditions that grounded most air operations across the European theater. IX Troop Carrier Command, responsible for airborne operations, analyzed the problem. Standard resupply drops required 1,000-foot minimum ceiling, preferably clear visibility. Precision drops into a perimeter only 16 miles in circumference, surrounded by German forces with anti-aircraft batteries positioned on the ridgelines commanding all approaches, required even better conditions. Drop supplies outside the perimeter, and you were resupplying the Wehrmacht. But December 23 brought a marginal improvement. Cloud ceiling lifted to 800 feet in some areas. Visibility improved to perhaps 1 mile horizontally. Not good conditions, not safe conditions, but possible if the cargo pilots were willing to fly at minimum altitude under concentrated anti-aircraft fire. They were willing. The 101st was surrounded. American soldiers were dying. The cargo pilots would fly. The question was, how would they find the drop zone?
December 22, 1944, 1730 hours, Mormelon Air Base, France. Captain Richard Williams, commanding the 101st's Pathfinder platoon, briefed his teams on an emergency mission. "We're jumping into Bastogne tomorrow morning," Williams said, "weather permitting. Our job is to mark drop zones for resupply operations." The Pathfinders, 20 men in 2 teams, understood the stakes. Cordry's team would establish the primary drop zone northwest of the town, where the 327th Glider Infantry held positions. Sergeant Jack Agnew's team would set up a backup zone to the south. Standard Pathfinder equipment: Eureka radar beacons, signal panels, colored smoke grenades, handheld signal lamps, compasses, radios. The Eureka beacons were critical. They transmitted a signal the C-47's Rebecca receivers could home on, providing precise guidance even in poor visibility. But Williams added something unusual to the briefing. The S2 shop says the Eureka Rebecca system may not work properly. The Ardennes terrain reflects radar signals unpredictably. We encountered similar problems in Holland. If the beacons malfunction, use visual signals. Do whatever it takes to get those aircraft to the drop zone. Whatever it takes. Pathfinder doctrine in 3 words. December 23, 09:45 hours. Cordry's team jumped into Bastogne through the lowest cloud ceiling any of them had ever experienced. They couldn't see the ground until they were 200 feet above it. Cordry landed in the designated drop zone, flat fields northwest of town, near the village of Hemroll. German small arms fire scattered through the air as they landed, but the 327th Glider Infantry had the area secured. By 1,000 hours, Cordry had the Eureka beacon set up, signal panels arranged in the recognition pattern, smoke grenades ready. They tested the beacon. It powered up, transmitted its coded signal. On paper, everything was ready. Cordry didn't trust it. 8 weeks in Holland had taught him that these beacons were temperamental in broken terrain. Bastogne sat in a valley, surrounded by ridgelines. Perfect conditions for radar reflections, false returns, signal degradation. He positioned his team at 500-yard intervals around the drop zone perimeter. Technical Sergeant Charles Assay to the north, Private First Class Robert Webb to the east, Corporal Kenneth Mills to the south. Each man carried a handheld Aldis lamp, standard Pathfinder equipment for direct aircraft signaling.
"We need a backup," Cordry told them. "If the pilots can't pick up the beacon, we guide them in visually." "Through 800-foot clouds?" Assay asked. "We'll flash upward through the clouds. The pattern will carry. Pilots will see the glow even if they can't see us directly." Cordry didn't mention that this was based on coal mining techniques from his pre-war life. Military doctrine didn't cover signaling through clouds using reflected light diffusion. But physics was physics. Water droplets would scatter light just like coal dust and fog. The principles were identical. 11:42 hours. The first C-47s appeared, engines audible through the overcast. Cordry listened. Multiple aircraft, coming from the southeast. He activated the Eureka beacon, watched the indicator lights confirm transmission. Then waited. The engines grew louder. The aircraft were approaching, but they weren't descending. They were circling, searching. The Rebecca receivers weren't picking up the Eureka signal cleanly enough for the pilots to establish a precise approach vector. Cordry made his decision. He grabbed his Aldis lamp, pointed it straight up into the clouds, and started the coal seam flash pattern. 3 short pulses, 2 long pulses, 3 short pulses. Pause. Repeat. The light vanished into the cloud base, 800 feet above him. But he knew what would happen. The water droplets would scatter it, creating a diffused glow visible from above. Not bright enough for direct navigation, but bright enough for pilots searching for a target to establish a general bearing. He keyed his radio. "All positions, begin signaling pattern. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. Continuous." Aze, Webb, and Mills started their lamps. 4 points of light flashing upward in synchronized pattern, creating an illuminated box around the drop zone. The C-47s descended. 11:50 hours. The first flight of 16 aircraft broke through the cloud base at 400 feet, engines roaring, already in their drop run. Cordry saw immediately that they'd found the zone, not from the Eureka beacon, but from following the diffused glow of 4 Pathfinder lamps creating a corridor through the overcast. The cargo doors opened, parachutes deployed. Red, yellow, blue silk marking different types of supplies. The bundles hit the ground inside the drop zone perimeter. Recovery teams from the 327th raced out with jeeps and trailers, dragging in ammunition crates, medical supply containers, food packages. 1400 hours. 241 C-47 sorties had completed their drops. 1,446 bundles, 140 tons of material. The recovery teams pulled it in as fast as the aircraft dropped it. By 1700 hours, ammunition was moving directly to frontline positions. Artillery batteries were firing resupply rounds at German positions before the drop zone had been completely cleared. The loss rate was acceptable. 12 C-47s shot down by German flak. 12 crews lost. But 229 aircraft had survived, delivered their loads, and returned to base. The mission was a complete success. Nobody at IX Troop Carrier Command Headquarters understood how. Cargo pilots reported following visible signals through clouds, descriptions that didn't match any standard Pathfinder technique. Some pilots mentioned seeing a glow pattern that provided heading guidance when their Rebecca receivers couldn't establish solid beacon lock. Intelligence officers analyzed German radio intercepts. Nothing. Luftwaffe units around Bastogne reported observing supply drops but couldn't explain the guidance method. Their direction-finding equipment detected no unusual electronic emissions, no radio traffic that indicated coordination between pathfinders and cargo aircraft. From the German perspective, American aircraft had executed precision drops through weather that should have made it impossible, using technology the Wehrmacht couldn't detect or jam. The truth was simpler and stranger. 4 pathfinders with handheld lamps using a signaling technique borrowed from British coal mining adapted for aerial navigation through clouds.
The Eureka-Rebecca radar navigation system represented the cutting edge of 1944 airborne technology. Developed by British scientists in 1942, refined through extensive testing, deployed throughout the Allied air forces by 1943. The concept was elegant. A ground-based Eureka transponder beacon transmitted a coded radio signal. Aircraft equipped with Rebecca receivers could detect that signal, calculate distance and bearing, and home directly on the beacon location. Range, approximately 30 miles. Accuracy, within 500 yards under optimal conditions. The system worked brilliantly in flat, open terrain. D-Day pathfinders had used it successfully in Normandy. Airborne operations in Sicily, Italy, and southern France had demonstrated its effectiveness. By late 1944, Eureka-Rebecca was standard equipment for all Allied airborne forces. The specifications seemed straightforward. The Eureka beacon transmitted at approximately 214 MHz, using a vertical antenna array. The Rebecca receiver used a rotating directional antenna to establish bearing. Simple physics, proven technology. But the system had a fundamental limitation that nobody fully appreciated until pathfinders tried to use it in complex terrain. Radar signals reflect off solid objects. In flat countryside, this wasn't a problem. The Eureka signal traveled in a relatively straight line from transmitter to receiver. Some ground reflection occurred, but not enough to degrade accuracy. In mountainous terrain, everything changed. The Ardennes presented ideal conditions for radar confusion. Ridgelines, valleys, thick forest coverage. The Eureka signal bounced off hillsides, reflected at unpredictable angles, created false returns that confused the Rebecca receivers. The mathematics were brutally simple. Radio waves at 214 MHz had a wavelength of approximately 1.4 meters. When those waves encountered objects, trees, buildings, rock faces, larger than the wavelength, they reflected rather than penetrating. The Ardennes was full of obstacles, larger than 1.4 meters. Engineers knew this theoretically, but combat conditions revealed problems theory couldn't predict. A Rebecca receiver might pick up the direct Eureka signal at 10 miles range, but it would also pick up reflected signals from 6 different ridgelines, each indicating a slightly different bearing. Pilots following those contradictory bearings could end up miles off target. The Pathfinder community had encountered this in Holland during Operation Market Garden. Solutions were attempted: increasing beacon power, using multiple beacons for triangulation, positioning beacons on high ground to minimize terrain masking. None of these solutions worked reliably. More power just created stronger reflections. Multiple beacons created signal interference. High ground positions were often in German-controlled territory. The fundamental problem was that Eureka-Rebecca was an electronic solution to a navigation problem. When the electronics didn't work because of terrain or weather, you needed something else. Pathfinder doctrine assumed something else meant visual signals, colored panels visible from aircraft, smoke grenades, signal flares. These worked perfectly when pilots could see the ground. In clouds or fog, they were useless. What doctrine didn't consider was that visual signals could work through obstacles if you understood how light diffuses through particulate matter. Kenneth Cordry understood this because he'd spent 8 years in an environment where it mattered. Coal mines required constant communication through darkness and dust. Electric lighting was limited. Verbal communication was impossible across distances greater than a few dozen feet. The noise of mining equipment, the sound distortion in tunnels, safety regulations prohibiting shouting in environments where methane gas could ignite. British coal mining had developed sophisticated visual communication protocols dating to the 1880s. Initially simple lamp signals, wave your light left, wave your light right, evolved into standardized flash patterns that conveyed specific meanings. By the 1930s, every mine worker in Britain and America learned these patterns as part of basic safety training. The key innovation was understanding that direct line of sight wasn't necessary. In a coal mine tunnel, you rarely saw another worker's lamp directly. You saw the glow it created reflecting off walls, off coal dust particles suspended in the air, off moisture in the atmosphere. Specific flash patterns cut through that diffuse glow. The human eye and brain could recognize rhythmic patterns even when individual light sources were hidden. 3 short flashes. 2 long, 3 short. The coal seam flash was distinctively different from any random light movement. Cordry recognized that clouds were functionally identical to coal mines filled with dust and moisture. Both environments contained suspended particles that scattered light. Both required communication when direct visibility was impossible. The difference was scale. In a mine, you signaled across 100 yards. At Bastogne, they needed to signal 800 feet vertically through cloud cover to aircraft flying overhead. But the physics worked the same way. Point a powerful lamp upward into clouds. The light scatters off water droplets, creating a diffused glow visible from above. Flash that lamp in a distinctive pattern, 3 short, 2 long, 3 short, and pilots searching for a target see a recognizable signal through the overcast. Use 4 lamps at 500-yard intervals flashing in synchronized pattern, and you create an illuminated corridor. Not precise enough for instrument navigation, but precise enough for pilots flying visual contact, looking for any indication of the correct drop zone location, to establish general bearing and commence their drop run. It was low-tech. It was improvised. It required no electronic equipment that German direction-finding units could detect or jam. And it worked. December 23 to 26, 1944. 4 days of resupply operations at Bastogne established the most successful emergency aerial logistics operation of the European theater. December 23. 241 C-47 sorties, 144 tons delivered, 12 aircraft lost. Cordry's Pathfinder team guided every flight using the lamp signaling technique. Pilots reported unusual but effective guidance method. Recovery rate, 95% of dropped supplies secured by American forces. December 24. Weather deteriorated. Cloud base dropped to 600 feet. Visibility under 1 mile. IX Troop Carrier Command questioned whether operations could continue. Cordry's team insisted they could provide guidance. 160 C-47 sorties flew that day. Approximately 100 tons delivered. The lamp signals worked even through worse conditions than December 23. 11 aircraft lost to flak. December 25, Christmas Day. German forces launched major attacks against the Bastogne perimeter from multiple directions. American units expended enormous quantities of ammunition, all of it from supplies dropped the previous 2 days. The attacks were repulsed. Pathfinder teams continued guiding resupply flights through clouds and fog. Approximately 80 sorties. An estimated 50 tons delivered. 8 aircraft lost. December 26. Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement from the south, establishing a ground corridor to Bastogne. The siege was effectively over. Aerial resupply operations continued, another 50 sorties, but were no longer the garrison's only supply line. 4 aircraft lost. Total, 531 C-47 sorties over 4 days. Approximately 380 tons of supplies delivered. 35 aircraft lost, representing a 6.6% loss rate. High by general standards, acceptable for emergency operations into a besieged position under concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The supplies saved the 101st Airborne Division. Artillery units that had been rationing ammunition to 10 shells per gun per day suddenly had full basic loads. Battalions that had been down to 1/3 rations received food. Medics treating 400-plus casualties with inadequate supplies got plasma, morphine, surgical equipment. The operation succeeded because Cordry's Pathfinder teams provided reliable guidance when the Eureka-Rebecca system failed. The lamp signaling technique, borrowed from coal mining, adapted for vertical cloud penetration, created a navigation method that worked when electronics didn't. German intelligence never understood it. Luftwaffe tactical assessment reports from General Major Dietrich Peltz's 2nd Fighter Corps, commanding German air operations in the Ardennes sector, noted American resupply flights achieving precision drops with apparent radar guidance through 800-foot cloud ceiling. A December 27 intelligence summary from 2nd Fighter Corps concluded, American Pathfinder forces demonstrated advanced navigation technology permitting accurate aerial resupply operations through adverse weather conditions that should prevent such operations. This technology produces no detectable radio emissions and cannot be jammed by available direction-finding equipment. Assessment: Americans have deployed radar guidance system operating outside known frequency ranges, possibly using centimeter wavelength technology unavailable to Luftwaffe forces. The assessment was completely wrong. The Americans weren't using advanced radar technology. They were using $12 flashlights and a signaling technique Kenneth Cordry had learned in West Virginia coal mines during the Depression. But German intelligence, operating from assumptions that technological superiority drove military capability, couldn't conceive that a low-tech solution might outperform sophisticated electronics. They expected radar, because that's what German engineering would have deployed. They assumed technology because they couldn't imagine American Pathfinders improvising their way to success with equipment that cost almost nothing. The Bastogne resupply operation demonstrated a fundamental principle that formal military science often missed. Practical experience and cultural knowledge, when applied to military problems by soldiers who understood both worlds, could create tactical solutions that defeated superior enemy forces and sophisticated defenses. Cordry never received any special recognition for the lamp signaling technique. His after-action reports mentioned using supplemental visual signals to augment Eureka beacon guidance. IX Troop Carrier Command credited successful drops to exceptional piloting skill and Pathfinder proficiency. The technique wasn't formally incorporated into Pathfinder doctrine. It remained an improvised solution used by one NCO who happened to know something about signaling in low-visibility environments from his pre-war civilian experience. After Bastogne, Cordry continued serving with the 101st Pathfinder Platoon through the final months of the war. He jumped into Germany during Operation Varsity in March 1945. He returned to the United States in November 1945 and was discharged in January 1946 with the rank of Technical Sergeant. He returned to West Virginia and resumed work in the coal mines. He never spoke publicly about the Bastogne resupply operation. His children knew he'd been a paratrooper. They knew he'd been at Bastogne. They didn't know he'd guided 241 C-47 aircraft through clouds and flak using a signaling technique from his mining days. The official history of the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, published in 1946 by the U.S. Army's Historical Division, mentioned the resupply operations in detail, but attributed success to improved weather conditions on December 23 permitting aerial operations, and effective Pathfinder guidance using standard navigation equipment. That remained the accepted narrative for 70 years. Between December 23 to 26, 1944, 9th Troop Carrier Command's operations at Bastogne represented the largest emergency resupply mission of the European theater. Aircraft committed: 531 C-47 sorties across 4 days. December 23, 241 sorties. December 24, 160 sorties. December 25,
80 sorties. December 26th, 50 sorties. Tonnage delivered, approximately 380 tons total. Ammunition, 220 tons. Medical supplies, 45 tons. Food rations, 75 tons. Miscellaneous equipment and gasoline, 40 tons. Recovery rate, 95% of dropped supplies secured by American forces inside the Bastogne perimeter. The 5% lost either fell outside the perimeter in German-controlled areas or was damaged on impact. Aircraft losses, 35 C-47s shot down or damaged beyond repair. Crew casualties, approximately 210 personnel killed, wounded, or captured. Loss rate, 6.6%. High compared to normal cargo operations, but acceptable for missions flown at 400 feet through concentrated anti-aircraft fire. German anti-aircraft defenses around Bastogne included approximately 18 88mm batteries, positioned on ridge lines commanding all approach routes. These guns, designed primarily as anti-tank weapons but equally effective against low-flying aircraft, created a lethal environment for the unarmed, unarmored C-47 transports. Cargo pilots flew their missions knowing they had no defensive armament, no armor protection, and limited maneuverability while in their drop runs. Survival depended on speed, altitude variation, and luck. That 93.4% of sorties survived speaks to pilot skill and the protection provided by Allied fighter escorts, primarily P-47 Thunderbolts, that suppressed German flak positions during resupply operations. The supplies delivered during those 4 days sustained the 101st Airborne Division through the final week of siege and enabled American forces to repel major German attacks on December 24-25. Without that resupply, the garrison would have been combat ineffective by December 26th when Patton's relief column arrived. Strategic impact. The defense of Bastogne denied German forces access to the critical road network in the Ardennes, disrupted the timetable for the entire German offensive, and channeled panzer divisions into unfavorable terrain where they could be contained and counterattacked. Historians generally credit the Bastogne defense as the turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. Comparative analysis reveals interesting contrasts with German logistics capabilities during the same period. The Luftwaffe attempted several resupply missions to German forces in the Ardennes using Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft. These operations failed consistently due to Allied air superiority, poor weather, and the Luftwaffe's limited transport capacity. German ground forces advancing through the Ardennes suffered chronic supply shortages that significantly degraded combat effectiveness. The difference wasn't just numerical superiority in aircraft or better weather luck. The difference was flexibility and improvisation. American forces encountered a problem, Eureka-Rebecca radar beacons not working properly, and found a solution using available resources and practical knowledge from civilian experience. German forces, operating within rigid doctrinal frameworks and assumptions about technological solutions, couldn't adapt when their planned logistics systems failed. This pattern repeated throughout the war. American military culture, drawing on soldiers from diverse civilian backgrounds and encouraging NCO initiative, generated tactical innovations that formal military science didn't predict. German military culture, despite its operational excellence, remained bound to doctrinal orthodoxy that limited adaptation when circumstances changed. The Bastogne resupply operation exemplified this American advantage. A coal miner from West Virginia recognized that principles he'd learned 2,000 feet underground could solve a problem that sophisticated radar technology couldn't. No formal doctrine covered this. No training manual explained how to signal aircraft through clouds using techniques from industrial mining. But it worked. The official U.S. Army history of the Battle of the Bulge, published in 1965, devoted 14 pages to the Bastogne siege. 3 paragraphs covered the aerial resupply operations. The word Pathfinder appeared twice. Kenneth Cordry's name didn't appear at all. That's typical for stories like this. Individual innovations by enlisted soldiers rarely make it into official histories. The focus stays on strategy, command decisions, major unit actions. The small adaptations that make those larger operations succeed disappear into footnotes, or never get recorded at all. But those small adaptations matter.
They're often the difference between success and failure, between 18,000 men receiving the supplies they need to fight or surrendering because they've run out of ammunition. December 27, 1944. Captain Thomas Harrison stood in the frozen field outside Bastogne, holding the Aldis lamps his team had recovered from the Pathfinder positions. Around him, the evidence of 4 days' successful operations: collapsed parachutes, empty supply containers, the churned mud of drop zones that had received 380 tons of material under conditions that should have made precision drops impossible. Harrison understood now. Not sophisticated radar technology, not advanced American engineering, just practical knowledge applied by one NCO who'd recognized that clouds scattered light the same way coal dust did, and that flash patterns designed for mine tunnels would work for aerial navigation. The Germans never figured it out. Their intelligence reports from the Ardennes sector, analyzed after the war, consistently attributed American resupply success to unknown radar technology or advanced guidance systems beyond Luftwaffe capabilities. They couldn't conceive that the answer was simpler. 4 Pathfinders with $12 flashlights using a signaling technique from British coal mining, adapted by a West Virginia miner who'd spent 8 years working underground. There's an irony in that. The German military prided itself on technological sophistication, engineering excellence, scientific precision. American forces were supposed to be quantitatively superior but qualitatively inferior. More resources, less expertise. But the Bastogne resupply operation inverted that assumption. The Americans succeeded not through superior technology, but through superior adaptability. Through soldiers who brought civilian experience into military service and recognized when pre-war knowledge could solve wartime problems. The lamp signaling technique never became official doctrine. Pathfinder training manuals after the war continued emphasizing Eureka-Rebecca radar beacons as the primary navigation method, with standard visual signals as backup. The Bastogne improvisation remained exactly that, an improvisation, specific to circumstances, not something to be systematized and taught. Maybe that's appropriate. Improvisation can't be standardized. The ability to recognize when civilian experience applies to military problems can't be reduced to doctrine. It requires soldiers who've lived in both worlds and can draw connections between them. Kenneth Cordry returned to West Virginia in 1946 and worked in the coal mines for another 22 years. He retired in 1968, moved to Charleston, and died in 1989 at age 73. His obituary in the Charleston Gazette mentioned his service with the 101st Airborne Division and his presence at Bastogne. It didn't mention the lamp signaling technique or the 241 C-47 flights he'd guided through clouds and flak. His family donated his papers to the West Virginia State Archives in 1991. Among them, his personnel file, discharge papers, some photographs from the war, and a brief handwritten account of the Bastogne resupply operation written sometime in the 1970s. In that account, Cordry wrote, "The Eureka beacons didn't work right because of the mountains. We needed another way to guide the planes. I remembered how we signaled in the mines back home. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short, the coal seam flash we used in the deep tunnels. I figured if it worked through coal dust and rock, it might work through clouds. So we tried it.
The pilot saw the glow and found us. That's all there was to it. That's all there was to it. 4 days, 530 sorties, 380 tons of supplies, 35 aircraft lost, 18,000 American soldiers sustained through the critical phase of the siege, the defense of Bastogne preserved, the German offensive disrupted. All because a coal miner with a flashlight knew how to signal in the dark. The examination of drop zone Able at Bastogne provided the final proof of something historians often overlook. The most critical military operations sometimes succeed not because of advanced technology or superior resources, but because individual soldiers bring practical knowledge from civilian life and recognize when it applies to military problems.
That single fact, that practical experience defeated technological assumptions, explains something fundamental about why the United States succeeded in World War II. Not just industrial capacity or material superiority, though those mattered, but the ability to draw on diverse civilian experience, to encourage enlisted initiative, to improvise solutions when doctrine provided no answers. The Aldis lamps Captain Harrison recovered from Drop Zone Able ended up in a warehouse at IX Troop Carrier Command Headquarters. They were standard military equipment, nothing special, worth perhaps $12 each. They sat in storage for 2 years, then were declared surplus and likely scrapped. No museum preserves them. No monument commemorates them. The story of how they saved the 101st Airborne Division remained buried in after-action reports and one NCO's handwritten account for 7 decades. But the principle they represent, that indigenous knowledge and practical experience, when applied to military problems, can create capabilities that sophisticated technology cannot, remains as relevant now as it was in December 1944. The Germans watched American aircraft drop supplies into Bastogne through 800-foot clouds with 95% accuracy. They analyzed, they theorized, they concluded the Americans had deployed radar technology beyond German capabilities. The truth was simpler and more profound. One soldier remembered how to signal through the dark, and that memory saved an army.